Hello and welcome to Artful Inquiry, Edinburgh College of Art's research podcast. I'm Dr. James Cook, ECA Director of Research, and today I'm joined by Dr. Valerie Wright, Lecturer in Modern Scottish History at the University of Edinburgh, along with Dr. Alistair Fair, a reader in Architectural History at ECA. Today we're going to be talking about their new book, Building Modern Scotland, the Architectural and Social Histories of Scottish New Towns. Begun between the late 1940s and the late 1960s, the new towns, East Kilbride, Glenrothes, Cumbernauld, Livingston and Irvine, were a key element of the planned welfare state, attracting international attention and widespread publicity. Building Modern Scotland tells a fresh history of the new towns, combining architectural and social history to illustrate what was planned, what was built, and how these places were experienced by the communities who lived and worked in them. Funded by Leverhulme and drawing on archives and oral history, the book provides a new account of modern Scotland, its buildings, places, and its people.
Hi, James.
Hello.
Okay, so for listeners who may not be familiar with the term, maybe you could start by explaining what a new town is and why Scotland saw the creation of 6 of them after World War II.
So the New Towns programme was a nationwide programme of construction which began after the Second World War. And essentially what this saw was the creation of a series of planned communities across England, Wales and Scotland, and later also Northern Ireland. And essentially this was all to do with thinking about where people should live and where employment and industry should be located. In Scotland, one of the key drivers behind this was the fact that Glasgow, or parts of Glasgow, were really very overcrowded after the Second World War. And so there was a plan produced which suggested that several 100,000 people should move out of Glasgow to allow the reconstruction of these overcrowded parts of the city at more acceptable densities. So, of course, you've got to think, well, where are these people going to go? Where are people going to move from Glasgow to? So the plan proposed a number of locations around central Scotland where new towns could be begun. And the important thing about these was that they wouldn't just be houses. The planners were very aware that during the 1920s, 30s, there'd been some big housing estates built, not just around Glasgow, but other large cities as well, but that those housing estates really had nothing more than places to live. And they were also seen as very kind of homogenous places for kind of one class or type of person. So the idea behind the new towns was that you would have houses, but also jobs. You would have amenities, shopping, schools, and all of this would be holistically planned and delivered largely by the public sector to start off with. So, as I say, this is run by central government. It's coordinated in Scotland through the Scottish office in Edinburgh. And the first Scottish new town was East Kilbride, just south of Glasgow, which was begun in 1947. And that was very quickly followed by Glenrothes in Fife, and then a little while later by Cumbernauld, Livingston, Irvine and Stonehouse. And it's important to say that, these places were not necessarily for those people who had lived in the slums in Glasgow. Actually, the people who moved to the new towns tended to be drawn from a young, skilled kind of working class population, often who were determined to make a better life for themselves and for their families. So people chose to move to these new towns, and they were enormously attractive in those early decades as people wanted to make that new life for themselves.
Thank you. So, Valerie, your research examines a range of social history, so that looks at housing, gendered employment, deindustrialization, and also how families and communities have made use of urban space. From a social history perspective, then, what was the significance of these new towns, particularly in terms of reshaping Scottish society and people's everyday lives?
I mean, they offered people an opportunity to live differently. So as Alistair said, this was about kind of decentralising the population, getting people out of overcrowded areas in Glasgow. And I think we can kind of underestimate how bad conditions were sometimes, okay? So you've got, flats with no inside toilets. You've got toilets in the back court. If you were lucky, you had them in the landing between three dwellings, three tenement flats. So it was about improving conditions, hot running water, indoor bathrooms, all these sorts of things that people wanted. So giving people those opportunities to move somewhere that was green, that they had their own front and back garden, that they had space. It was, as Alistair says, about aspiration. People wanted a better quality of life and crucially for their children. So how does this reshape sort of working class Scotland? Well, I mean, in our oral histories, there was certainly people with that sense that they could move away from traditional kind of ways of being, ways of living in the city, and reinvent themselves to some extent when they went out to the new towns. And that wasn't always the case. Again, as Alistair says, there's an element of social selection. So the Development Corporation would send someone to visit prospective tenants in their old homes in Glasgow, and they would be vetted. How clean is the house? Are you paying your rent regularly? People told us about memories of the officers coming to visit, and mum having had the house cleaned, spick and span, awaiting the inspection essentially. Are you respectable enough to get into our new town? So when people moved out there, the sort of pioneering generations, when they went places like East Kilbride, Glenrothes, people came from all over Fife as well as through from Glasgow and through from Edinburgh to Glenrothes. It's such an interesting place. I mean, they're all interesting. But people were starting afresh in brand new communities. I mean, the other thing that's really interesting was that the development corporations were really keen to make these cohesive communities where they weren't all, working class. There would be a mix of classes. One of the things that's coming to mind now when we're talking about Glenrothes, what was meant to be for coal mining communities to relocate from Lanarkshire, Ayrshire and move through to Fife. And the idea was that they would disperse the miners throughout the town so that they weren't all in the one area, which I think is quite interesting. In the end, I don't really think enough miners went. That there was a kind of sense of a mining community, although, there was a big social... what do they call the Cisco, the miners' welfare, basically, where everybody hung out. But it is interesting to think of how the development corporations wanted to create places where there would still be a sort of kind of hierarchy, a cultural hierarchy. So they wanted, in Glenrothes, had art clubs. East Kilbride had all sorts of cultural associations and clubs. And the idea, especially, I'm remembering from the development corporation records in Glenrothes, was that the middle classes had to be kept in the town in order to provide an example, an aspirational example for the working classes, which I think is really interesting. So they had to build housing, the development corporations, that would be attractive to the middle class executives in the towns, as well as the aspiring, respectable working classes who are moving in.
So the idea is essentially to kind of lift up the working class towards that as much as possible.
I mean, that's your perception of it too? Yeah, I mean, definitely. There was this idea that there would be, a promotion of, this is the Labour Party of the immediate post-war decades as well, where it's, Alistair knows very well, they're building theatres, they're sort of... rhetoric around television is that it should be improving. That, people shouldn't just be going to the bingo and playing the pools. There's this whole improving rhetoric of the Labour Party in the post-war decades and especially the 60s. So it's the new towns kind of play into that as well. These are kind of seen as slightly utopian spaces where we can build anew. I think.
But it's also the idea, as the historian Guy Ortolano has said, you can see the new towns as almost the kind of spatial manifestation of the post-war welfare state. So this is the idea that if you provide people with good housing, education, healthcare, that, society will be better. And what's important here is that infrastructure was seen to be a way to deliver social goals in terms of a kind of happier, healthy population, but also economic goals as well in terms of creating high quality jobs. And one of the particular concerns there, in particularly in central Scotland, was that heavy industry in Glasgow was already in decline and had been really since the end of the First World War, and Scotland had been very badly affected by the Depression in the 1930s. So in that respect, the new towns were about almost rebuilding the Scottish economy. But as I say, it's the idea that to achieve that economic goal and the associated social goals as well, you had to build places. And so you see in these new towns that idea of a welfare state literally given a kind of built form, and in ways that, in some respects now feels quite paternalistic to us, patronising. Even the idea that people should be on this constant quest for self-improvement, and that they were being vetted, and all these sorts of things. And certainly when I teach the new towns, the students are often a wee bit kind of horrified by this, that that there is this kind of selective quality to that.
Finding things in the archive where, the vox pops that, journalists would go out from Glasgow to visit Cumbernauld, and, how are the people getting on? And people would say things like, we've bettered ourselves by moving here. And you think, but I mean, to our sort of 21st century ears, it does feel a wee bit like, but I mean, the early generations of people who moved out to the new towns, I mean, I think it's fair to say it felt they were special people and special places.
Kind of frontier spirit there.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
like a cut above. This was somewhere that it was proud. You were proud to say, I've kind of moved to Glenrothes. I'm out in East Kilbride. We've went to Cumbernauld, because these were cutting edge, all the best of facilities, brand new schools, brand new shopping centres eventually when they were built, but everything was provided for you. I think people like the paternalism, actually. I think they quite like that, being looked after.
Well, I think if you've struggled through the Depression of the 30s, you've had the experience of the Second World War. And as I say, the people that moved to the new towns often weren't from the very poorest slums, but they were perhaps sharing with parents. Young married couples often lived with their parents immediately after marriage, or they're in, sort of cramped accommodation. So to actually move out of that after this long period of hardship, there really was a sense, I think, in the 50s, as you go into the 60s, that these were better days, and things were being, provided for you. And these places were, seen as being, as Val says, a cut above, but also, nationally and internationally famous.
Yes.
The New Towns programme.
Kind of feted.
Yeah. I mean, it was overseen by central government, and the idea was this would be kind of the benchmark as good quality in terms of planning and architecture as you could get. So you've got a lot of thought going into the master planning process. You've got talented young architects, engineers, landscape architects, all wanting to work in the new towns, ambitious kind of administrators and so on. And what they produced was regularly featured in the popular media, in the print media, on television, as that becomes increasingly common, in the architectural press, and internationally as well. And there are perhaps slightly apocryphal stories of international delegations coming and visiting the new towns in Scotland and beyond, because they wanted to see these places and this really kind of high quality built environment that was being provided. So that is one of the stories of the new towns, that they come about through this very distinctive policy context. They are delivered separate from what, say, Glasgow City Council was building, and they are seen as these special places at the time. And for historians, they're really great places to work on, because the archive is so good.
It's so rich.
But I think there is always a slight sort of caveat that you have to throw in, that they are brilliantly archived, and they are really, really interesting places. But at the same time, they're only part of the story. So the new towns now in Scotland house, I think it's about 250,000 people, which is actually not a small part of the population, but it's not an absolutely enormous number. And if you looked across the UK, you'd be into the millions. But again, it's just a part of that kind of post-war housing drive, but a really interesting part, particularly because it allows you to tell an architectural story, and also to look at these kind of broader themes in terms of society as well. And that was the sort of thing we wanted to do with this research project and with the book that's come about from that.
I suppose it's interesting that that's kind of it is a particular moment in history, and that they came about, they expanded. We haven't had a sort of new wave of them. They haven't continued to expand in perhaps the same way the sort of great conurbations have. So it seems like they were a particular historical moment, a reaction to a particular...
saying that right enough, in the most recent history of the new towns, they have expanded from the 90s onwards in terms of private housing estates. So they have all got much bigger. And that's been a source of tension within those communities, because the people who are kind of sort of earlier generations don't always see those later additions to their towns as part of the town. But I think that's not unique to the new towns. That's a story right across Britain, where you're getting these large housing estates, on the edge and in the periphery, and commuter belts all around the sort of major conurbations, where it's like, what are these sort of places, and they're not built in the same ways as the new towns were, with all those facilities and amenities and the idea of community being built in.
I suppose near us there's sort of Winchborough, for instance, which was a small village.
Which has been dramatically expanded,
vastly larger, and again I suppose a similar way to the new towns, with whole new schools, large shopping centres. That feels very much on a smaller scale.
But also, I think the difference with something like Winchborough, or the developments that are going on in East Lothian at the moment, is that, they're a lot smaller than the new towns. The East Kilbride was originally intended for kind of over 40,000 people, and the target was increased several times. But also that the new towns had, each was basically delivered by a body called a development corporation. Val's already mentioned them kind of interviewing people. So what happened was the government would set up a development corporation for each of the new towns. And the development corporation was responsible for effectively delivering the master plan, for generating employment by almost literally advertising the place and tempting in employers to come and relocate there, often internationally, and they were often very successful at that. And also in the early years, the development corporations would build and manage and rent out most of the housing. So there was that absolute oversight, and that changes through the history of the new towns. By the late 1960s, there's a growing emphasis on building housing for sale, owner occupation, and that increases subsequently afterwards. But all of the development corporations were wound up, and they came to an end in the 1990s. And that's something that people that in the oral history kind of almost regretted. They saw a sense of loss as that special body that had existed solely to kind of look after the new town no longer existed. But the key thing about the development corporation was that it had that kind of oversight. It was not dealing with a gazillion other things across a bigger area. Its focus was the new town, and it was run by people who were committed to the new town. So that, in a way, is the big difference, I think, apart from size, with some of the developments that have been happening more recently that development corporation model doesn't exist. And these things are now delivered by, local government working with the private sector to a much bigger degree. But having said that, I think the other thing that's really important that came through in what we talked about in the book was that the new towns were very adaptable to change. So in the late 1940s, you've got something like East Kilbride, almost all the housing rented out by the development corporation. It's tempting in kind of light engineering industry. But by the 1960s, you've got this greater emphasis on owner occupation. By the 1980s, the development corporations are not really building housing in the same way. They're working much more with the private sector. So the idea of what a new town could be absolutely changed over time.
Definitely.
And that even the purposes of the new towns changed over time as well. So somewhere like Livingston, although there was still an ambition for people to move from Glasgow, Livingston was seen as a kind of economic powerhouse for central Scotland. An economic
growth point, for the Central Belt, essentially. And in economic terms, I guess we've talked about it a wee bit. This was rebuilding, as we say, rebuilding the Scottish economy. But we can't overestimate what it would have been like to move from, say, heavy engineering in Glasgow to working in a bright new factory.
Making computers or calculators or something like that.
Working for an American company. Think about the role that American inward investment had in Scotland in that immediate kind of, from the 40s onwards and especially into the 60s. And all those companies eventually leave Scotland because we're, for lower wage workforces. But then we sort of try and tempt in, companies from Japan, other areas of Southeast Asia. So that idea of bringing sort of light engineering, sort of computing later on, all these sorts of companies, getting them to look at where do they want to go. They don't want to go to brownfield sites. Especially after the Second World War. The Scottish Development, the Scottish Executive, the government, the Scottish Office, found it really difficult to try and tempt in companies from overseas to come to Glasgow because they didn't want to, which is another reason for the new towns, was this idea of greenfield, brand new factories. And they're nice places for folk to work as well.
And a different sort of housing as well. And obviously, Victorian Scottish urbanism, Edinburgh, Glasgow, you're dealing with tenement flats, and a fantastic architectural legacy in some cases. But there was a perception that actually what people wanted was a house.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a perception particularly that people investing into Scotland, whether that was from England, where obviously there was a much stronger tradition of houses rather than flats, but indeed North America as well, that the workforce would want houses with a front door and a back door and a garden.
Yeah.
So, again, the Scottish office for that reason was finding that employers didn't want to invest into Glasgow because there was, it wasn't just that the sites didn't seem right or that they were put off by the image of the city, but also there was a sense that these international businesses wanted houses for the workforce, and the new towns were able to provide that. So the houses that the new towns were building were popular with people from Scotland who enjoyed the privacy of moving out of a communal tenement stare, but also the businesses as well.
Such an important point you make there as well about that idea of moving away from sort of communal living, and there's so much discussion in historiography and in the work that historians are publishing at the moment around sort of community and what it means, and what people wanted in terms of community living. And I think, the new towns did offer people that degree of privacy while still being part of a collective, but not as enforced sociability that you get in tenement living.
I suppose you're looking at a really interesting moment there where, yes, the sort of nature of employment is changing, but the nature of the family unit is changing vastly. Both in terms of sort of aspirations of people, but also, I suppose, the kind of the practicalities.
I remember one of the examples for the interviews that I did, it really spoke to me was the idea. It was one woman told me about, her mum didn't like going to the steamie. And it's one of those things that in Glasgow is very much celebrated, and we've got a play, a wonderful play about it. But that idea of having to go and do your washing once a week in a communal facility and being bold enough to kind of take your shot of different machines. Our mum was just more timid and didn't like that.
Yeah.
And you get that. You understand that.
Yeah.
Like fighting for your turn in the wash house out in the back court and stuff like that as well, and having to take your turn of cleaning the stairs and all the sorts of things that were expected. And just the fact that everyone knew your business. Everybody kind of knew your business. Everybody knows who had borrowed money from people. All those sorts of things that I think the idea of being able to move somewhere which wasn't really that far away, but felt like you were moving to another world. It must
have felt like a different planet.
Yeah. And I think this is really key because, as Val says, there's been a lot of work by social historians in recent years about the idea of community and the extent to which that was transformed in the post-war decade. And certainly community was important to the planners of the new towns. So somewhere like East Kilbride or Glenrothes was divided into what were called neighbourhood units, and each of those was centred on local schools and shopping. And the idea on the one hand was that, that was a very practical way of dividing up the town so that you could walk to the shops and the school without having to cross main roads. But it was also the idea that the neighbourhood would be the source of identity and you would see yourself as part of that. And that does start to unravel very, very quickly, actually, because, it was realised that actually people didn't think in those kind of very localised terms and that people maybe wanted to make connections with, others who were interested in the same things, who might live in other districts and that sort of thing. And particularly as more people had cars, they were going to look further afield. So, we chart in the book some of the ways in which that idea of community evolved, and we engage with that literature, but we do also stress the idea that privacy was a really key theme in post-war housing, not just to be contrary, but you can see it in the kind of official literature on how to design a post-war public sector house, and it talks about visual privacy, soundproofing, all these sorts of things, and you see it in the ways that people responded to this sort of housing. It's what they wanted.
It's a difficult, it's just one of those classic, it can be both. People both want to feel like they're part of a community, but on their terms. But ultimately what we would close their door and have their sort of family-based leisure and not, have to feel like everybody knows their business. Exactly that. So it's about choice, isn't it?
It is.
It's about opportunity, and that's what the new towns, that was the word we kept coming back to. It offered opportunities to people, and not everyone. And as time went on, we say the new towns were socially selective. As time went on, they were less socially selective. And there was this sense over time that, they're just letting anybody in, which I think is quite interesting in how the towns were shaped over time. They become quite like most other Scottish towns in the sense that there are the aspirational areas that everybody wants to live in and the less popular areas that people don't want to live in. And I found when I went to the towns and I was walking around, architecturally, the sort of ones that were least popular were the ones that I thought were really interesting. And I was like, these houses are really, I remember a lady with a dog walking by and going, what were you doing, pet? And I was like, these houses are really interesting. And she was just like, oh, she gave me a funny look, But it is those sorts of things where it's like everybody wants to live in the areas that are most like what you would imagine, in suburban England, actually, not even suburban Scotland, but like if you picture what a house looks like that a child would draw, that's kind of where they want to live. And that's the areas that were most popular and aspirational in probably all of the new towns.
I was wondering then if we could talk a little bit more about the book. You've mentioned that. So that the book is coming out of a big Leverhulme funded project as well. So I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about the book, what that's about, and also a little bit about the research project, its sort of methodologies, its aims, who you're working with, and kind of what you're hoping to achieve with the broader project.
So the book is called Building Modern Scotland, and it's been recently published by Bloomsbury. It's available as a print volume, which you can buy, but it's also available as a free download. So this is an open access book, thanks to the generosity of the project funding, and that can be downloaded from the Bloomsbury Collections website. So the project came about 6 or 7 years ago now. We began thinking about this. And the starting point was to bring together architectural history and social history. Yeah. On an architectural side, we were aware that there hadn't really been a single book about the Scottish new towns since the 1990s, when a very short survey had been published. And we wanted to kind of go back to them with the benefit of a kind of longer hindsight, and the benefit that in most cases now the archives are available as well, and to think about what the architecture and planning of these places might tell us in the kind of wider contexts of post-war architecture in Scotland and across the UK and beyond. And so I was talking to my colleague Miles Glendinning, and we also have often worked with Dan Waters and Cat Breen, and we were aware that we were all interested in the architecture of the new towns, but we were also aware of the work that was being done at Glasgow University by Valerie and by Lynn Abrams.
Yeah, we'd done a whole project on the kind of history and long-term legacy of high-rise flats in Glasgow. So another Leverhulme funded project that we'd worked on with Aid Cairns and Urban Studies and Barry Hazley, who's now down at Liverpool. And that was a great project, just kind of going back into archives and understanding people's kind of experience in the 1960s of moving from, again, cramped conditions into these brand new high-rise buildings. So we'd been working on that. And as part of that project, we built on work that Lynn Abrams had done with Linda Fleming. They'd done a whole lot of oral histories in East Kilbride. And so we kind of followed up on them and did some of our own interviews. Interviewed a couple of friends of mine that had grown up in East Kilbride. They're about 10 years older than me, so in the 1980s. And just thought, so we'd done all of that. We'd written an article on East Kilbride, and I think you'd read it.
Yeah, we'd seen this, and we
you'd
thought,
kind of got in touch with
let's
us.
bring all of this together and see if we can put together something which looks not only at the original ideas behind the new towns and what was built, but also the ways in which that was experienced. Architectural history often sort of stops at the day the building is finished and doesn't pick up that story of kind of ongoing
I
life.
remember Alistair had invited me through to give a paper through here at Edinburgh, and I had hit this line in it where I said something like, well, architectural historians only care about the buildings, but they don't really care about the experiences of those that lived in them. And I thought, that's a wee bit provocative, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Yeah.
And we all went out for dinner afterwards, didn't we? And we were like, what could we do? Yeah. And that was the roots of it all.
So that was the basic idea, and we were very fortunate to get Leverhulme funding for the project, which allowed us to put together something that lasted 2.5 years. It produced a few articles as well as the book. But as I say, the idea was to bring together these kind of architectural and social ambitions, to think about the new towns as a group of distinctive places architecturally, and also to think about how they could engage with current social historical debates about things like community, gender, the family, work, leisure, these sorts of key topics.
And it was quite, it was tricky at points, wasn't it? Because all of the new towns, including the famously never built stone house that Alistair could talk about for hours. I'm only joking. But yeah, they're all quite distinctive, the Scottish new towns. They're quite different when you go and you walk about in them. Like we talk about the Scottish new towns as if they're kind of one.
Yes.
But they were all built for different reasons to some extent, and they've got quite different feels. People make these jokes about, roundabouts or concrete or, the famous the buildings that have become most well known in each of the towns, and which ones are successful and what's not successful. And I don't really like to think about them in those terms. I think they're all successful in their own ways, and they all had very different objectives given where they are in Scotland. And I think at various points we've been asked, what's your favourite new town? I couldn't have a favourite. I like them all.
Yeah.
I'm unashamedly quite defensive of the new towns. I think sometimes people can be overly negative about them. We've got to remember, this sort of idealism around that planning, and what the problems that they were trying to solve, essentially,
No, it is really, important, I think, to emphasise that clearly not everything that was done worked. And mistakes were made in terms of architecture and planning, and perhaps even in terms of some of the kind of industrial planning as well. But at the same time, these were house several 100,000 people, and they remain popular. So that is a sort of tremendous achievement, and delivered often in times of quite difficult economic circumstances, particularly the very early years of the New Towns programme in the kind of late 40s, early 50s. So there is a sort of important achievement in all of that, which isn't being realised in the same way.
I think it's fair to say neither you or I are into sort of counterfactual history, but you can't imagine Scotland without the new towns. Because they were fundamental to reimagining the future of the nation in terms of bringing in new industry, in terms of offering people opportunities. Again, not something we looked into in any great depth because we didn't, at the time, we weren't really thinking in these terms when we were writing the book. But subsequently, we've talked a lot about, this was a period in which thousands of people were leaving Scotland to go and live in England and live abroad. So, the new towns are fun, helped people who otherwise maybe would have migrated either down to England or Corby and places like that, or going overseas. Canada, Australia.
Yes.
They were able to have a new life within Scotland. And I think that opportunity was very important too. But just in terms of kind of propping up the Scottish economy for decades, that's essentially kind of what they did.
They have been, controversial. One of the key moments in the kind of story of the new towns comes in the 1970s when essentially policymakers began to question whether it was a good idea to keep moving people out of Glasgow and to keep this kind of expansion in the new towns, and whether actually there would come a point where you kind of really needed to invest more into Glasgow itself. And so there's a sort of big tipping point around 1976 when, after having built fewer than 100 houses in Stonehouse, to say, no, that's it. We're not actually going to build any more in Stonehouse. And that new town was stopped, and the other new towns were kind of scaled back. And the investment did then start to go back into Glasgow. And again, that's a sort of important moment in the history of the new towns. And again, and indeed the kind of history of modern urban Scotland, as that focus on urban renewal and what was the inner city becomes much more of a kind of term of debate in the late 70s. But the new towns kept going, and I think one of the things we wanted to do in the book was to talk about the new towns in the 1980s and 90s. So it's not just that they were all different, but that actually they did all keep going, and that you don't just have this moment where the new towns end in the 1970s and there's nothing more to say about them, because they continued to be developed by the development corporations until the mid-90s, and they're continuing to grow now.
Particularly crucial to the Scottish economy in the 80s and 90s in terms of attracting continual inward investment from overseas, multinational corporations. Silicon Glen.
Yeah.
You know, in Livingston and being a particular example, also in Glenrothes. So this idea of bringing kind of high technology industry into Scotland, the expansion of shopping, huge. And think about some there like East Kilbride, Livingston, in terms of a focus where people get in their car and drive to shopping centres. You know, so like in terms of the transformation of the Scottish economy into services and retail and all those sorts of sectors in the 80s and 90s, really fundamental too.
And these are new types of building. And I think, you know, when people think about the architecture of the new towns, they often think about the kind of landmark structure, some of the churches perhaps, or something like the Dolan Baths in East Kilbride, sort of fantastic concrete vaulted space. Cumbernauld Town Centre, which was an attempt to rethink what a town centre might be in a kind of age of affluence, consumerism, car ownership. So instead of just, you know, building a conventional town centre and maybe pedestrianising it, they kind of thought, actually, let's start from scratch and have a clean sheet idea. So there are all those sorts of landmark kind of, I hate to use the word iconic, but, you know, those one-off structures. But actually, the key thing about the new towns was this kind of just general modern environment.
Good quality.
The idea of the modern house, the modern school, the modern factory or office building, business parks. You know, East Kilbride is inventing the idea of a kind of, you know, landscaped business park through this period. The idea of new types of pub that were respectable, if you like, but sort of in inverted commas, that weren't just kind of spit and sawdust. New sorts of hotel, and you see this in the archive information when you're reading through. You know, there are discussions of the new sorts of delicatessen that you might find in East Kilbride or Cumbernauld, or you know, this kind of, you know, slightly kind of again aspirational hotel and the sorts of meals that it's serving, and it's got Urquhart furniture in the bar, so it's picking into that kind of Scandi modern kind of vibe. So, you know, this is about creating a kind of a new sort of modern landscape where you can live in a new way. You know, your house has maybe got central heating, so you're not all huddled round the kind of stove in the kitchen, but actually you know, you can live in the whole house. The children can be upstairs in their rooms listening to records or doing their homework or whatever. That you can go to new sorts of shops where you do self-service, you're not queuing up behind a counter. You're working in a new sort of clean, light, bright factory. You're moving through this new sort of urban landscape. And for me, I think actually, you know, much as the kind of set piece one-off buildings are important and interesting, it is that everyday modernism of these environments which is really, really key. I mean, that's one of the things I always, when I'm teaching and in my own research, this idea of kind of, you know, mainstream modernism is really important to me, because again, I think it's too easy as historians to kind of fixate on those one-off buildings and the ones that there's a kind of a lot of theoretical baggage behind, and the ones where the architects promoted themselves and their work kind of in the most noisy fashion. And actually, that isn't how modern architecture was experienced by the vast majority of people.
It's the everyday.
It's the everyday that's really key, and the new towns are really important in kind of, you know, explaining that. Now, as I say, it's a really good every day, because there was that idea of making it the best that it could be.
I mean, that's one of the main lessons, isn't it? Is the investment in time and effort that went into planning, and as you say, flexible planning and contingencies, and especially somewhere like Glenrothes, where they were dealing with a crisis after another, and they just had to kind of like respond to that and still make the best of it. And I think that's the same for most of the new towns. They all face hurdles that have to be overcome. And yet they're able to still provide these lovely environments. And one of the things that really came out of most of the interviews is the appreciation of green space and landscaping too. So it's not just the kind of built environment, but also everything that goes with it. So sort of, for example, you know, during COVID, one of the interviewees told me he never had to do the same walk twice. You know, when we had our one walk a day, I mean, he could walk all round Glenrothes. There were so many different routes you could take. And it is a lovely space to walk around.
And they worked with landscape architects. You know, they had in-house landscape expertise. East Kilbride brought in Brenda Colvin in the early years, who was one of the pioneer landscape architects, to advise on their plans. And then they, you know, the development corporations had the money and the staff to maintain these landscapes as well. So it was a really key part of the kind of planning vision. And this is, you know, it's one of the differences that you might see in the sorts of urban developments that are being built now, that because so much more is down to the private sector and in terms of making the development pay, that sort of thing gets squeezed out. Now, that's not to say that the new towns were a sort of financial black hole. Actually, they did generate money. East Kilbride regularly returned a surplus to the treasury. So these were incredibly profitable places, if you want to see them in those terms. But it's the fact that the public sector had that oversight of them and was able to plan this kind of broader infrastructure and facilities right from the start in a way that the private sector would not have done, and to deliver that and to keep it going over that long-term holistic vision. And in that respect, the development corporations were not political bodies. They were appointed by the government, but they were not elected by people. And so they could kind of take a long-term view. It wasn't just about winning the next election or, promising what people want to hear. They could take that kind of long-term view.
There's advantages and disadvantages
Absolutely.
to that, obviously, but...
They could seem remote to people. Sometimes they could seem a bit sort of beyond scrutiny. But I think, in terms of thinking, in England, they're now talking about having another generation of new towns. And I think that development corporation model as a kind of coordinator, at the very least, over the long term, there's a lot to be said.
I mean, that's one of the main complaints that people had at the wind-up, and I think we've not mentioned that wind-up was later in Scotland than it was in England. I think I'm right in saying England it was about 84, 85.
Some of them earlier, some of them slightly later, but mostly in the mid-80s.
Whereas Scotland, it was 95, 96. And I mean, places like Irvine felt like, there was people in Irvine felt that the new town hadn't even really got going. And then others were like, well, it was never a new town anyway. So, there's some tensions around that. But broadly speaking, in most of the narratives that I've ever heard about people who have been long-term residents in the new towns will say everything was good until wind-up. Now, that's not strictly the key. Factually, well, it's debatable, it's subjective, but it really did mark a point in which people went from feeling that things were looked after to them not being looked after, both in terms of there being that body that you could kind of turn to if you had complaints and accountability. And then with that gone, it's like, well, you're just shoved in with everywhere else and we're no longer special and the trees are not being made and the grass isn't being, and and it's that there's not the same holistic vision for the town. They're just having to kind of be like everywhere else. So I think it is interesting just that when I go to the new towns and we were working in the project, I was walking around, I was like, well, it's gorgeous, there's so much green space, the trees are all mature now and they're just lovely places, especially when it's sunny. Lovely places to be. God, but the trees are too tall now. The bushes are all overgrown. It never used to be like that. A lot of, there was a lot of things that have been removed. Some of the public art is looking a bit sad. All these sorts of things where it was like, if there was still a development corporation, this would be getting looked after. And I think that's interesting to think about in terms of how public space and our infrastructure is sort of managed over the long term.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of those advantages of coming to a space that is fresh and blank, is that you do not need to knock down that block of tenements because it's in the way of where you want to have your trees. There is the opportunity to do that and to plan. But
and that's another point as well, I guess, is the long-term maintenance of the housing stock and some of the other buildings when they've been privatised.
Yes.
So through Right to Buy, lots of people bought their houses at huge discounts. I mean, initially, not so much. And I mean, the development, we've written about this, the development corporations kind of had difficulties. They had to help people with mortgages.
Because the houses were so good. They couldn't be sold at a loss. So they were better than you would have got in the private sector, and therefore people couldn't afford them.
So it was really quite difficult. And then they had to, eventually nationwide, across England, Scotland, Wales. I mean, there's a programme of, essentially we need to get rid of this housing because it's costing too much money. So, they're encouraging people to buy. So by the right into the sort of late 70s, I think I'm right in the trajectory here, that's when sort of larger and larger discounts begin to be offered.
Yeah.
And especially into the 80s. So then you have issues in some of the new towns where people buying property at, quite low rate and maybe not able to maintain what they've bought.
Yeah.
So when you walk around the new towns now, I mean, it's several of them, I think this is the case. The housing that remains as, housing authority is sometimes in better condition than housing that's been bought, especially if it's now been bought to let out.
Yep. Yeah.
So, it's the same kind of issues right across, urban Britain. But it's interesting to see it in the new town because it was kind of never intended, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
that's
there
what
was
happens.
the idea of that more kind of homogenous tenure, even if the housing itself was understood to be kind of diverse. But it's interesting that you mentioned about the idea of, the sort of greenfield site, because that was the case in somewhere like East Kilbride or Glenrothes to an extent, and Livingston. But somewhere like Irvine, that which was begun in 1966, 67. Irvine was already quite big to start with. There was already quite a substantial town there.
Which is why some people just don't see it as a new town
exactly,
at all. Yeah.
because the new town areas of it were kind of put sort of slightly beyond the existing town. And it's actually very typical of that late 1960s generation of new towns in England as well. Many of them, places like Peterborough or Warrington, were already quite big. But in Irvine, you sort of have this story where actually they did want to knock down quite a bit of the central area of the original town. And they had a sort of fantastical idea of how they could build a kind of structure that would be about a mile long, a building that would be a mile long, which would begin in the centre of old Irvine as a sort of shopping centre. And it would then kind of vault its way over various roads, a railway line, a river, and it would keep going along the kind of harbour foreshore. And there's a sort of wonderful moment in the master plan where it reaches the sea, and there's just a little arrow sort of pointing towards like Northern Ireland. And it's like they're not even going to stop for the sea. So there's this sort of real optimism and ambition on the part of the planners, and of course a lot of that doesn't.
You've got to love it, but I mean, I can't help but just look at, especially the Irvine New Town plan, and if you've never seen it, you go online and Google it and look at some of the images, because you just, their vision for what Irvine could be is just mind-blowing, really. You just...
And that speaks to the ambition that went through all of these new towns. I mean, Irvine, my hunch is that, it was begun at the end of the 60s, the plan was published in 1971, the economy was already falling into trouble at that time. There was already talk of public spending cuts and so on. I think the planners of Irvine knew
we never have to do this.
Well, they knew it was never going to happen in the way that they had dreamt. And so, unlike somewhere like East Kilbride, which had been going for 25 years and was, very well developed, or even Cumbernauld, which had been going for sort of 15, and the first phases of the town centre had been built in Cumbernauld. The planners in Irvine, I think they knew it was never going to happen to the fullest extent. So they published it as this really lavish book. I mean, it cost a fortune, this book. Very glossy paper, full colour images, and there's this sort of fantastic depictions of people having this kind of leisured new town lifestyle, kind of surfing and sitting out at kind of very nice bars and driving minis and MGB coupes around the place. And it's a fantastic document of what they thought they were going to do. Because, as I say, I think they had realised that it probably was never quite
going to
come to
fruition. It's the 70s Scotland should have had, but it's the 70s that Scotland should have had, where it was like, well, it's going to be we're all going to only be working 4 days a week, and it was imagine future in which we'd all be windsurfing.
They built some of that structure. The town centre bit of it was built very controversially, and people in Irvine that remember the old town centre will still say, even 50 years later, that this was a terrible. That the old bridge was demolished, and stuff was built in Irvine. Some really interesting housing, actually, which shows you the way in which modern architecture was evolving through the 70s into the 80s, and the way in which designers were looking to the Scottish vernacular and transforming elements of Scottish vernacular style in kind of new ways. So Irvine's really interesting stuff did happen, but you've got that balance between what happened as in a sort of much reduced form from the original master plan, but it does come back to that idea of being really ambitious and and bold, and trying to think about a whole new way of life, and that holistic vision, I think, is the real key to the new towns programme.
It's the same in Cumbernauld, isn't it? When you get you off the bus in the town centre and you walk round the original areas, up to the Riverside Park. You can imagine exactly what it was like in the 1960s, I think. I know there's been a lot of infill development, but you can kind of imagine all those kids running about. One of the interviews said to me she lived in a street with 10 houses. Every house had 3 children. So there's 30 kids in their street alone. And I mean, you can kind of imagine it when you walk around these spaces and just imagine all those children and then later on all those teenagers
Yep.
in this urban space, which is quite dense. You know, and you heard about all the pubs and the places that folk worked, and just like that sense of a community completely abuzz with people.
Yeah. But this is it. This was building a new Scotland. So it's a new way of life, and it's a new kind of urban image. It's not sandstone tenement flats. It's about modern architecture. It's about a modern landscape and the ways that you know could shape a kind of modern future. So that's why we called the project Building Modern Scotland. That's why we called the book Building Modern Scotland.
It's like a Gregory's Girl version of, of 80s Scotland, isn't it? You know, everything's bright,
old film.
everything's colourful.
But I mean, you know, and we do tell that in the book it's not all positive.
No,
and I think one of the things that
isn't.
came through in the oral history was that, you know, it could be challenging, it could be expensive. You know, people had to navigate changing family circumstances, changing, you know, as the economy changed. So it's not a story that we would want to sugarcoat. And again, I think, you know,
the new towns does not escape deindustrialization.
No. So one of the things the book tries to do is to, you know, not necessarily be balanced with a capital B, but it is about sort of, you know, thinking through some of the kind of, difficulties
I mean, I would say as
had.
much as there was change in sort of social behaviour, there's lots of continuities as well. You know, there was still sort of trade union organising in the factories. There was still sort of traditions of sort of working class life. You know, I'm thinking of Cumbernauld, where I think it was the Catholic Church, had a wee night on a Saturday night where people took drinking. It was like a nightclub because there was no pubs at that point. You know, so there was like ways in which people found spaces and places to have those same collective kind of sociability as what you would have had back in the old neighbourhoods of Glasgow. And then, of course, you would have people who would take their kids in to the East End of Glasgow every Saturday to go there or go to the football. Or, you know, they kept all that kind of stuff up. I mean, that's one thing, there was no real football clubs developed in the new towns. People continued to go and maintain those sorts of connections to older spaces as well. So I think that's interesting. So it's not all change.
No.
People did retain their idea of a kind of the same but different kind of working class culture.
But again, it comes back to that idea of options.
Exactly,
doesn't it? And
opportunity.
I think, again, one of the big take homes of the book is the idea that, you know, you can understand the post-war welfare state as not providing equally for everyone, but enabling some people to do things. And you know, and you can critique that. And one of the, you know, the criticisms which was levelled at the new towns by the late 1970s was that they were not dealing with the poorest in society. Those people were being left behind, if you like. And you know, that is a valid critique. But again, you know, it's about understanding what the reality of the post-war welfare state was and how that changed and how that can be seen. You know, in architecture.
We talk about the value of the educational opportunities that people had in the new towns, but not everybody I interviewed had that narrative. For some, you know, it was the same kind of stories as what I've heard elsewhere in Scotland around. You know, you left. You know, it was what queue you're going to join. What are you going to be a joiner or a welder? Or, you know, it wasn't quite that, but it was like what factory you're going to go and work in because you're not going. But then there's stories of people for whom they got to university and they were the first in the family to go, and maybe they wouldn't have had that opportunity had they not moved to the new town. So it is a subjective experience.
Very much so. The new towns as a kind of enabler of opportunity.
They were. Yeah, definitely.
So what can we learn from new towns?
I think one of the, you know, it's difficult to draw lessons from history. The post-war context was different. The context in which the new towns were conceived and delivered changed over, you know, the course of the new towns programme. But I think, you know, what's one of the big lessons for me is that the new towns shows us what a difference well-planned places can make to people's lives. And that if you build good housing, if you put in infrastructure, if you have a long-term vision, that actually these places can be socially and economically transformative and popular. So that, I think, is the challenge for policymakers and planners today, is thinking about how to do those sorts of things. There may be aspects of the new towns model that could work. We probably wouldn't do it all with the public sector now in the way that would have been the case in, say, the 1950s. But there are definitely themes that can be drawn out from them in terms of investment, long-term thinking, looking beyond the kind of immediate political cycle to the sort of 10, 20-year horizon. And also creating places that can accommodate change, thinking about, not planning them so tightly that if economic circumstances change or, the world of work changes in unpredictable ways, that you've kind of locked in too many assumptions. So it's about thinking about something which is flexible, malleable, if you like, at the same time.
Thank you very much. You can find more information about the research project in this episode in the show notes or on our website www.eca.ed.ac.uk/research. If you've enjoyed this episode of Artful Inquiry, please hit the subscribe button now to be notified of new episodes, and, of course, do share the podcast with people who you think would enjoy it. It just remains for me to thank our guests this week, Dr. Alistair Fair and Dr. Valerie Wright, and of course you, our listeners. Next time we'll be talking about the global history of modern dance.